This video is about adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. The goal is I can add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. So first, let's start with the review exercises. The directions say evaluate each expression. So number 1 is -3 to the third power. So that means -3 times -3 times -3. So -3 times a -3 is a +9. A +9 times a -3 is a -27. Number 2, we have the absolute value of -3 plus 8. So first I'm going to do what's inside the absolute value symbols. -3 plus 8 is 5. And then the absolute value of 5 is 5, because it's 5 units away from 0. Number 3, it looks like we're going to combine like terms here. So I have a -5y and a -9y. And then we have a +2x and a -4x. So first I'm going to start with the x's. A +2x minus 4x is a -2x. And then we have a -5y minus 9y is a -14y. So you have -2x minus 14y. Now let's look at adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. So your first step is going to be to find the least common denominator, which is the same thing as finding the least common multiple. Second, you're going to multiply each fraction by 1 to make equivalent fractions. And then the third step is then to add or subtract the fractions. So number 1, we have 2/5 plus 1/2. So first thing we're going to do is find the least common denominator. So I'm going to take both of our denominators, so one of them is 5 and the other one is 2. Now I'm going to list all the multiples of 5. So the way that I find the multiples of 5 is I'm going to start with 5 times 1, which is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4 is 20. We could keep going on, but I'm going to move on to 2 now. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 5 times 2 is 10. 6 times 2 is 12. And I can keep going, but I want to find the least common multiple, which is when is the first time that you see two numbers that are the same, that are in common. And I found this 10 right here is in common with both the 5 and the 2, so that makes this our least common denominator. So right now, when I look at 2/5 plus 1/2, I know that by the end of this, I want both of their denominators to be 10. So now we have to figure out how are we going to make both those denominators 10. Well, the second step says multiply each fraction by 1 to make equivalent fractions. So now what I want you to think is, what are we going to multiply 5 by? In our first fraction, that denominator, where are we going to multiply that by to get 10? Well, I'm going to multiply 2 by 5 to get 10, but then I also have to multiply the top by 2. Now, 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1. So that means that we're multiplying each fraction by 1. When you multiply any number by 1, that doesn't change it. And we don't want to change the 2/5. We just want to put it into a different form that's the same thing as 2/5. We're going to do the same thing with 1/2. What do I multiply 2 by to get to 10? And I multiply it by 5. So I also want to multiply the top of the fraction by 5. And remember, 5 divided by 5 is equal to 1, so I'm not changing the 1/2. So now let's rewrite this. 2 times 2 is 4, and 5 times 2 is 10, which we already have. And then on the right side, we have 1 times 5 is 5, and 2 times 5 is 10. Now, since they have like denominators, they both have the same denominator, I'm going to keep the denominator the same, and I'm going to add the numerators. 4 plus 5 is 9. So I'm left with 9/10. Number 2, we have 5/6 plus 1/4. So I'm going to list out our multiples of our two denominators, 6 and 4. 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18. Now I'm going to move on to 4. 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, and there is our common denominator, which is our least common multiple. So I'm trying to make both of those fractions have the denominator of 12. So in order to make my first fraction have the denominator of 12, I need to multiply 6 times 2 to get 12, so I also have to multiply the top of the fraction by 2. So I'm really multiplying 5/6 times 1. And then how do I take 1/4 and make that have a denominator of 12? Well, I need to multiply 4 times 3, and I need to multiply the top of the fraction by 3. So now, starting with the left fraction, I have 2 times 5 is 10, and 2 times 6 is 12. With the right fraction, I have 1 times 3 is 3, and 4 times 3 is 12. Now I have like denominators, so 10 plus 3 is 13, and keep the denominator the same. Number 3, we have 3/5 minus 1/2. So I'm going to list out the multiples of 5 and 2. 5 times 1 is 5, 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 3 is 15. Now I'm going to move on to 2. 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, and 5 times 2 is 10. And there I see our least common multiple, which is going to be our least common denominator, is 10. So I want both of these fractions to have a common denominator of 10. For the fraction on the left, I'm going to multiply 5 times 2 to get 10. So I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction by 2. So 2 times 3 is 6, and 5 times 2 is 10. So I have 6/10. Now with the fraction on the right, I need to multiply 2 times 5 to get 10. So I also need to multiply the top of the fraction by 5. 1 times 5 is 5, and then 2 times 5 is 10. Now I can subtract these fractions. I'm keeping the denominator the same. And 6 minus 5 is 1. So we have 1/10. Number 4, we have 5/6 minus 1/4. So I'm going to list out the multiples of 6 and 4. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. 6 times 3 is 18. Now I'm going to, let's keep going. 6 times 4, let's do one more, is 24. Now let's move on to 4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. And there I see our common denominator, which is going to be 12. So I want both of these fractions to have the common denominator of 12. So I'm going to multiply 6 by 2 over 2 so that we get 6 times 2 is 12, and 5 times 2 is 10. On the right side, I'm going to multiply 4 times 3 to get 12. So I'm going to multiply by 3 over 3, which is the same thing as 1. So 1 times 3 is 3, and 4 times 3 is 12. Now I'm going to subtract the two fractions. 10 minus 3 is 7 over 12.